King Records, Cincinnati, February 1965. James Brown's band has been playing the same two chords for what feels like an hour. They are exhausted. They are sweating through their suits, and by any reasonable definition, they are in a mood. They are not down in a funk though. They're inventing one. And James Brown will not let them stop, because the bass line refuses to change. It just sits there, locked to one note, one groove, over and over, while everything else in the room seems to catch fire around it. What comes out of that room gets released as Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. It peaks at number 8 on the pop charts, hits number 1 on the R&B charts for 8 straight weeks, and wins James Brown his first Grammy. But the chart position isn't the important part. The important part is that music historians point to this exact session as the moment an entire genre gets born. Not because anyone in the room called it that, but because something about the rhythm itself just changed, permanently, and nothing downstream of it. Disco, hip-hop, funk rock, uptown funk, half of what's on pop radio right now, sounds the same again. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what funk actually is, because almost nobody can define it precisely, including people who've loved it for decades, but who built it, why it's structured backward compared to almost every other genre in Western music, and how it never actually went away. It got absorbed. It's sitting inside songs you'd never think to call funk, right now, today, and once you hear what to listen for, you won't be able to unhear it. None of this came from nowhere. The rhythmic habits James Brown drew on, call and response phrasing, cyclical grooves that loop rather than march in a straight line from verse to chorus. The whole idea that rhythm is something a group does together rather than something one drummer keeps time for. Trace back through the black gospel churches of the American South and New Orleans brass band's second line drumming, both of which carried rhythmic traditions with roots in West Africa across generations, through slavery into 20th century American popular music. Brown grew up immersed in that gospel tradition in Georgia and South Carolina before he ever picked up a microphone. Funk isn't a rupture in that lineage. It's that lineage, finally isolated down to its purest rhythmic core, with the melody stripped away so there's nothing left to distract you from the groove itself. Here's the part almost everyone gets wrong first. Funk is not a sound. It's not horns. It's not wah-wah guitar. It's not a slap bass line. Those are just the instruments funk musicians happened to be holding in 1967. Funk is a rhythmic philosophy, and it has a name because the musicians who built it gave it one, the one. In most Western pop and rock music up to that point, the emphasis falls on beat 2 and beat 4, what's called the backbeat, the boom clap you can practically feel in your shoulders. James Brown flipped it. He put the hard emphasis on beat 1, the very first count of the bar, and then let every other instrument scatter into short, syncopated percussive stabs around it, so that the horns, the guitar, and the bass all started acting less like melodic instruments and more like extra drums. Guitarist Jimmy Nolan's chopping, muted chicken scratch style on Papa's Got a Brand New Bag is the clearest early example. He's not playing chords, he's playing rhythm, almost like a hi-hat with strings. Brown described the bass line himself. It stays right there, it doesn't change, and the whole point is not to let the groove drop. That's the mechanism, but here's the part that actually makes it feel the way it feels. What funk musicians leave out matters as much as what they play. Ghost notes, muted, almost silent hits between the main beats, and dead space where a less disciplined band would have filled in a fill, both do real work. A funk groove is built less like a wall and more like a fence, mostly gaps, load-bearing anyway. Take away the discipline to leave those gaps open, and the whole thing collapses into ordinary R&B. Everything else in the song gets to be loose, unpredictable, syncopated, because there's one fixed point holding the whole structure together. Musicians who came up in that tradition still call it the same thing 50 years later. It all comes back to the one. Here's where the story gets more interesting though, because James Brown didn't just invent this and walk away. He enforced it on his own band with something close to psychological warfare. In 1970, a teenage bass player named William Bootsy Collins joined Brown's backing band along with his brother Catfish, right as Brown's classic lineup was being rebuilt. Bootsy was a phenomenal, restless player, the kind of musician who wanted to fill every open space with something. Brown hated it. Collins later recalled being pulled into Brown's dressing room after gigs he thought had gone great, only to be told, "You just ain't on it. You ain't on the one." It wasn't really about one bass note. It was Brown training his musicians to feel restraint as the actual skill, to understand that funk isn't about how much you play, it's about what you're willing to leave out. Bootsy has said as much himself. The discipline James Brown drilled into him became the foundation of everything he did next. You can hear the tug of war directly on record. Bootsy's first major session with Brown produced "Get Up, I Feel Like Being A, Sex Machine" later that year, a song built on essentially one chord for most of its runtime, powered by a call and response hook simple enough for an entire stadium to shout back, "Get up, get on up." There's almost no melody left in it at all by that point. Just the one, a horn stab, a vocal call, and a response. It's the most extreme version of Brown's idea he'd recorded up to that point, and it became one of his signature songs. And what he did next was leave. Bootsy eventually walked away from James Brown's band and landed in the orbit of George Clinton, a former doo-wop singer turned ringmaster who was busy turning funk's tight discipline into the loosest, most chaotic stage show anyone had ever seen. Under Clinton, the twin bands Parliament and Funkadelic didn't just play the one, they built an entire mythology on top of it. By the mid-1970s, Mothership Connection wasn't just an album title, it was a stage show. A full-size spaceship prop descending onto the stage in a haze of smoke, while Clinton, dressed like an intergalactic preacher, led the band into Give Up the Funk. It's easy to laugh at how over-the-top it looked. It's a little funnier to realize the same rigid one-note bass discipline James Brown drilled into a teenage Bootsy Collins was still holding the entire spaceship together underneath the costumes. Now, a common misconception worth stopping on. People assume James Brown sat down one day and consciously invented a new genre called funk. He didn't. The word existed decades earlier as jazz slang. Musicians as far back as the early 1900s used funky to describe playing that was raw, deeply felt, unpolished, even a little dirty, the opposite of studied and clean. James Brown didn't coin the word. What he did was spend roughly 3 years, from 1964 to 1967, gradually stripping chord changes and melody out of his songs and replacing them with pure rhythmic interlock, session by session, until the sound had drifted so far from R&B that people needed a new word for it. And the word that already existed in the culture, funky, was sitting right there, waiting to be repurposed as a genre name. Nobody declared it. It just accumulated until it was obviously true. Here's a second misconception, and it's one that undersells how big this genre actually got. People assume funk stayed a niche, black audience genre that pop radio mostly ignored. It didn't. Sly and the Family Stone, a band that was itself unusual for the era, black and white musicians and men and women sharing the same stage as equals, took Everyday People to #1 on the pop charts in 1969. And that same year, Sly and the Family Stone played Woodstock in front of a crowd that was by any measure a mainstream American rock audience. That band's bassist, Larry Graham, is widely credited as the person who invented the slap and pop bass technique, thumping the string with his thumb and snapping it with his fingers, sometime around 1968 and 69, reportedly to keep the low-end percussive on his own when the band was short a drummer. Ask anyone who's ever picked up a bass guitar what funk bass sounds like, and they'll show you Larry Graham's technique, not James Brown's. The style most people think of as the definitive funk sound wasn't even in the room in 1965. It arrived a few years later, invented out of necessity by someone else entirely. Think about how much of what you assumed was always funk turns out to have a specific birthday and a specific name attached to it. If you're the kind of person who likes finding out the real story behind the songs everyone knows, but nobody investigates. This channel exists entirely for that. A like helps put this in front of more people who'd get something out of it too. Now back to how far this thing actually spread. By the mid-1970s, funk wasn't underground at all. Earth, Wind and Fire, the Ohio Players, the Commodores, and Rick James were all landing on pop radio. Not just R&B charts. Funk was, for a solid decade, some of the most commercially dominant music in the entire country. The idea that it was ever a fringe genre doesn't survive contact with the sales figures. Third misconception, and this one trips up even people who think they know the genre well. Funk and disco are not the same thing, and they're not really cousins. They're closer to rivals wearing the same jacket. Disco absorbed funk's instrumentation, the bass-forward mix, the horn stabs, the syncopated guitar chank. But it threw out the thing that actually made funk funk. Disco locked everything to a steady, predictable four-on-the-floor kick drum, built for wall-to-wall dance floor consistency. Funk does the opposite. Funk's whole identity is unpredictability around a fixed anchor point. The one holds still so everything else can misbehave. Take that tension away, smooth it into a metronome, and you don't have funk anymore. You have disco, related family, different rulebook. It all comes back to the one. Disco is what happens when a genre decides it can live without it. But here's where you can actually watch the two genres collide, in one specific documented moment. And it's the moment that arguably invents hip-hop as a commercial genre. In 1979, a group called the Sugar Hill Gang released Rapper's Delight, widely credited as the song that took hip-hop from local New York parties to national radio for the first time. The instrumental underneath the entire track is a note-for-note re-performance of the bass line from Chic's Good Times, written by Chic's Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers, a song that sat right on the funk disco border itself. Nile Rodgers was reportedly furious when he first heard it. Uncredited, blasting out of a club before he'd even agreed to it. He got the credit eventually. But think about what that means. The bass line that helped launch hip-hop as a commercial force wasn't written by a hip-hop artist at all. It was a funk disco bass line, repurposed, looped and rapped over, because the groove was already doing exactly what a whole new genre needed it to do. Nile Rodgers didn't build that chugging, muted rhythm guitar style out of nowhere either. Music historians consistently trace it back to the same chicken scratch tradition Jimmy Nolan used behind James Brown a decade earlier. Funk's rhythm guitar filtered through a disco tempo. So the chain runs provably in one direction. James Brown's guitarist invents a rhythmic guitar style in the mid-60s. A disco band builds a hit around a version of it in 1979. And a hip-hop group loops that disco band's bass line the same year to build the song that puts rap on the radio. 3 genres, one unbroken rhythmic thread. Here's the part almost nobody knows though, the story behind the single most reused rhythm in modern music, and the person who never got paid for it. There's a specific 11-second drum break, recorded almost by accident, that might be the single most consequential 4 bars in the history of recorded music. And the man who played it never made a dime off it. In March 1970, James Brown's drummer Clyde Stubblefield played a loose, syncopated break during a song called Funky Drummer. It wasn't even the planned single. It was a jam, tucked into an album track. But that 11 seconds of Stubblefield's drumming, snare, hi-hat, and kick, locking into a pattern that feels like it's constantly on the verge of falling apart, without ever actually falling apart, turned out to be, by later count, the single most sampled drum break in recorded music history, appearing in well over 1,000 songs across hip-hop, R&B, pop, and electronic music, from Public Enemy to NWA to George Michael. Stubblefield played session musician, work-for-hire dates for James Brown. Under the copyright law of the era, only the songwriter of melody and lyrics was legally recognized as the song's author, not the drummer who created, on the spot, the single most reused rhythmic idea of the sampling era. He received essentially nothing in royalties from any of it. The most quietly influential drummer in modern pop music, largely never got paid for the thing that made him influential. That's not a footnote. That's the moment funk stops being a genre you can point to on a chart and becomes something more like infrastructure, a rhythmic skeleton other genres built themselves on top of, whether they credited it or not. Which brings us to the biggest misconception of all, the idea that funk died sometime in the 80s, swallowed by synth pop and drum machines, and that anything that sounds funky after that point is just nostalgia. A costume, not the real thing. It didn't die. It went underground and mutated, and it was hiding in plain sight the entire decade. Everyone assumes it disappeared. Take 1986, peak synth pop, peak drum machine, supposedly the least funky moment in pop history. Prince released Kiss, and it hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Listen to what's actually happening in that song. There's barely a bass line at all for most of it. There's more silence than sound. It's the one taken to its most extreme, minimalist conclusion. Prince stripping funk down until almost nothing is left except the discipline itself, and it still topped the chart in the heart of the decade funk supposedly skipped. Rewind slightly, because synth pop wasn't the only place funk was hiding that decade. On the rock side of the dial, a wave of bands were building their entire sound around the same rhythmic logic, just with distortion pedals attached. Living Colour brought funk's syncopated attack into hard rock in the late 80s. Red Hot Chili Peppers went even further. Bassist Flea has openly named Parliament-Funkadelic among his biggest influences, and by the time the band released Give It Away in 1991, they'd built an entire commercial identity out of slap bass and rhythmic interlock, wearing a rock band's distortion like a costume. Funk wasn't disappearing in the 80s and early 90s. It was quietly colonizing genres that didn't even claim it. Then, in the early 90s, funk resurfaced as its own explicit hybrid, G-Funk, the sound Dr. Dre built his 1992 album, The Chronic around. Heavy, whining synth leads, deep bass, laid-back tempo, built almost entirely on the DNA of Parliament-Funkadelic, the same band Bootsy Collins joined after leaving James Brown 2 decades earlier. Dr. Dre wasn't sampling funk ironically or referencing an old genre for flavor. He was extending the same lineage, the one, filtered through West Coast synthesizers, still holding the whole track together the same way it did in 1965. And then funk came all the way back out into the open, credited by name. In 2013, Daft Punk released Get Lucky, featuring Nile Rodgers on guitar, the same Nile Rodgers who, decades earlier, co-wrote the Chic song whose bass line had quietly launched hip-hop. In 2015, Mark Ronson and Bruno Mars released Uptown Funk, which spent 14 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, tying for the second longest run at the top of that chart in its entire history, trailing only Mariah Carey and Boyz II Men's One Sweet Day. 14 weeks, in 2015, for a song built almost entirely out of a 1967 rhythmic idea. That's not retro. That's not pastiche. That's the same genre, on the same chart, doing the same job it did 50 years earlier, because the underlying mechanism never actually stopped working. Pop music didn't outgrow funk, it just stopped labeling it. It all comes back to the one. So here's the reframe worth sitting with. Almost every time a pop song makes you move without you deciding to. Almost every time a bass line feels like it's talking to the drums. Almost every time a track leaves more silence than sound and somehow feels fuller for it. You are hearing a 50-year-old rhythmic argument that a tired, sweating band in Cincinnati settled once in one room and never lost. If you want more of these, the real story sitting underneath the song you already know. Subscribing is the easiest way to make sure the next one finds you. Drop a comment with the last song that made you move without asking permission first. I read everyone, and a few of them turn directly into future scripts. One more before you go, because it didn't fit anywhere else in this story, and it deserves its own spotlight. That mothership, the actual spaceship prop George Clinton and Parliament-Funkadelic descended from during their outrageous 1970s stage shows, the one that turned a concert into a genuine mythology, wasn't scrapped when the tour ended. In 2011, Clinton donated it to the Smithsonian. It now sits on permanent display inside the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., which means the single most theatrical prop in the history of American music now lives in the same building as the Star-Spangled Banner and Emmett Till's casket on the One. Permanently, forever.